Hello, everyone. We are so happy to welcome you to this town hall, whether it's morning, afternoon, evening, from wherever you're joining us. We know that this is an exciting and a stressful time, so we want to answer as many questions as we can to help alleviate some of those stressors. First, I would like to acknowledge that myself and the panelists here today, as well as Dalhousie, is on the land of Mi'kmaq. Dalhousie University is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. Land acknowledgements are only a small part of cultivating strong relationships with the First Peoples. Acknowledging territory and First Peoples should take place in the larger context of genuine and ongoing work to forge real understanding and to challenge the legacies of colonialism. We also wanted to take this moment to acknowledge the histories, contributions, and legacies of the African Nova Scotian people and their communities who have been here for over 400 years. So my name is Heather Doyle, my pronouns are she and her, and I will be your moderator for this session. I work here at Dalhousie as the Director of Assessment and Special Projects in the Division of Student Affairs, and I support the areas of student experience as well as leadership. Over the past year, we have received questions from students, family, and friends on a wide variety of topics, including travel restrictions, COVID requirements, academic structure, and housing. With the fall term beginning in a little over a month, we wanted to create an opportunity to address some of these questions live with experts from across the institution. We have a wide variety of experts here to join us and to answer your questions. You can see on the slide, we wanted to make sure that we had lots of people available to be able to address the myriad of things that we know are on your mind. We will start with comments from two of our panelists, which is informed from the questions that we have been receiving, including those prior to the event. We will then start answering our live questions. The Q&A is now open, so feel free to start posting your questions. You will see the Q&A at the top right-hand side of your screen. If you are on a mobile device, you will want to click on the question mark icon. If you would like to turn on closed captioning, please click on the CC button. This session will also be recorded and it will be posted online after the event at www.dal.ca/fall2021. If we aren't able to get to your questions within this hour, you can actually email us at student.affairs@dal.ca, and someone will actually email you back directly. If you submitted a question beforehand and it was not specifically answered, someone will reach out to you, one of our team members, via the email that you used. Please also take note of the information posted on this slide as some of the many resources available to you at Dalhousie. We'll post some of these links in the chat as well, and this slide will be available again at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Verity Turpin, who is our Acting Vice Provost of Student Affairs. So Verity, over to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Hello, everyone. And on behalf of Dalhousie, we are excited to be welcoming our community back to campus this fall. It has been, as Heather said, a challenging 16 months, and I would like to start by acknowledging the significant efforts by our students to stay the course throughout the pandemic. It has certainly not been easy, and I continue to be inspired by what our students have accomplished and how our community has pulled together and supported one another. This fall, many of you are coming back to campuses for the first time in a very long time, and some of you will be setting foot on campus for the very first time. Some of you may be keen to get back on campus, while others may be feeling anxious. We recognize that the return to campus comes with mixed feelings. And we hope today's Q&A will help address some of the questions you have around vaccination, travel, and our safe return to campus this fall. I also want to highlight that although we are getting set to officially welcome back to campus many of our staff, faculty, and you, our students, many of our community have been working, learning, and living on our campuses over the last 16 months under safety plans guided by our partners in public health, all without incident. As we transition back to campus and to in-person learning and teaching on our campuses, our libraries, our study spaces, fitness facilities, as well as most of our residences and dining halls will be open. Our events and activities, including undergraduate and orientation programming, will resume in person. And I encourage all of you to watch our website, dal.ca/new to Dal, for an up-to-date list of how you can get the most from your student experience at Dal. Our health and safety of our students, faculty, and staff has been and continues to be our top priority. My good colleague, Jerry, our Executive Director of Environmental Health and Safety, is here with us today and is going to speak about our safety plan and how that aligns with our province's reopening plan. Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Verity. I'm so pleased to be able to speak here today. I want to first start by just talking about Dalhousie and the experience throughout the pandemic. Dalhousie has been very safe throughout this pandemic. In fact, we closed very rapidly early on in the pandemic, but we did remain open for critical research and experiential learning, and actually including some on-campus residents for the duration of the pandemic. And we actually managed to do that very safely and without any cases associated to transmission at Dalhousie. But we didn't do this in isolation. We did this by working closely with the Department of Labor and Advanced Education and working closely with public health. In fact, Dalhousie was one of the leaders in helping develop a reopening plan for the entire post-secondary institutions group for all of Nova Scotia in the spring. Nova Scotia now finds itself in phase 4 of their reopening plan. So that has allowed some relaxations in Nova Scotia, but we're really optimistic we're going to hit stage 5 early in August or before the end of August. That is when we have 75% of our population vaccinated. So Dalhousie students getting vaccinated is a critical role in helping Nova Scotia open broader. And it's kind of embedded within that reopening plan that we need to have the student population vaccinated. But you know, vaccination is not mandatory. It's not mandatory to be vaccinated coming on campus, but it will make travel easier for those that come to Atlantic Canada. And it's a really effective way of protecting yourself and the broader community within Dalhousie from getting sick from COVID. So we definitely are encouraging it. While the province hasn't released all the details of the plan, we do have some ideas of what we think they will look like. So this plan has currently been reviewed and approved by the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, and is on the desk of public health at the moment. And is really focused from a post-pandemic perspective, because remember, this plan in September is once we cross that 75% barrier of folks being vaccinated. So in that post-pandemic lens, we're looking at how we can keep in place some of the things that we learned during the pandemic and applying them to subjects beyond COVID. So we learned that they were good for all communicable and respiratory-borne illness. So some of the subjects that I'd just like to cover, these are what we're expecting will be in the final plan as it's approved, will be around the use of masks. We don't expect there to be a formal requirement for the use of masks, but we do expect public health to be issuing some recommendations for the use of masks in kind of crowded indoor areas. And Dalhousie will respect those recommendations and respect the personal preferences that people would have around the use of masks. I did get to see one question that was submitted, and it was around, will masks be required in teaching spaces and labs? So we will be following the public health advice, and just if the recommendation is prudent, then we would be recommending their use, but not strictly requiring them, just to be clear. Another thing that we know that worked really well during the pandemic was keeping people apart and doing things around crowd control. So that physical separation part, and that did add a benefit. And then Dal will be looking to figure out ways that we can control the crowds on our campuses to live up to that request within the public health new plan. One of the other ones that we know that was really important is the thought around general ventilation in spaces. So Dal has been very aggressive in that field. And actually, we have performed ventilation assessments in all of our teaching and learning spaces. And there's lots of work have already been done, and there's work that will continue throughout the summer to make sure that the ventilation is adequate in all of those spaces. So we're really excited about those. We also know that hand hygiene and general cleanliness are very important as well. So Dal will be continuing with all of its cleaning and sanitization processes and keeping available all of the hand sanitizing that you might expect. There were a couple other questions that I thought I could respond to in my opening comments, and that would be along of the lines of what would be the class capacities for in-person learning. So right now we expect all of the learning to be primarily in person, but there may be some differences from faculty to faculty depending on their individual programs. I was asked a question: if there were a COVID-19 exposure on campus, what would be the response and how would that be handled? Well, we've got advice from public health that by the time we get to the September timeline, that they will be ending their investigation of every single COVID case, and they'll be switching back to their previous kind of communicable disease model. So if they saw an outbreak or areas of concern, they would be looking more towards those. The last thing that I wanted to comment before I pass back to Heather would be on asymptomatic testing. So Dalhousie has been involved in an asymptomatic testing program for some period of time, and we expect we will continue that as long as there's need for that. So, we believe Dalhousie can operate very, very safely. We work super closely with the Department of Labor, the Labor and Education, and we work very, very closely with the Public Health Department. So Dal doesn't do any of this in isolation. We're doing this all in coordination with our regulatory groups. And with that, Heather, I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jerry. And as we can easily see from the chat, is you all have tons of questions like we had anticipated. And so, as I mentioned, just to make sure everyone is aware, if we don't get the chance to get back to each and every one of you, or if maybe your specific question is specific to your unique circumstances, you can email that student.affairs@dal.ca email address, and we will get back to you, someone from our team. So we wanted to start with a question that was submitted prior to the event and really does actually relate to many of the questions I see in the chat. And this is going to go to Cynthia Murphy. And so Cynthia is our Director of Student Experience. She also oversees our International Center and is our expert on campus around international quarantine. So Cynthia, we have a number of students asking about approved vaccines from different countries and how they know what is allowed to not have to quarantine. Or what if they have two vaccines not approved by the World Health Organization, but a booster that is an approved vaccine? Cynthia?
Thanks, Heather, and thanks for the questions. I'm reading the questions as they're coming in through the chat, and can see that there are lots of questions about vaccines and quarantine. So I will start by saying that all of the vaccination requirements and our quarantine plan are governed by the federal and provincial governments. So when folks ask about Dalhousie policies, they are closely connected and they are driven by the policies of the government. So when it comes to vaccinations, currently Canada, excuse me, has 4 approved vaccines that you will need to have full doses at least 14 days before you enter the country in order to be exempt from quarantine. any combination of other vaccines or less than the fully required doses will mean that you will have to quarantine when you arrive in Canada. And there are some significant updates that were just released yesterday with some important dates around that. So currently, if you arrive in Canada and you are required to quarantine, you have to spend the first 3 days or perhaps a few more at a hotel at your airline port of entry. And that will end on August the 9th. So on August the 9th, when you enter Canada, whether you are exempt from quarantine or not, you will not have to quarantine at the the port of entry. And that's important to students because it was a significant cost associated with that. You'll be required, if you are required to quarantine, you'll need to come to Halifax where you'll quarantine for your 14 days. And I see a lot of questions too about, do I need a quarantine plan even if I think I'll be exempt? Yes, you do. All international travelers coming into the country are required to have a quarantine plan in case they don't meet any of the requirements at that time, and that is determined by the Canadian Border Services Agency. So it's important that you have that quarantine plan, and the first step in all of this planning for travel is to contact the International Centre. That link was included in the resources that Heather posted, and it's important that you develop that quarantine plan with them. And there are several requirements for documentation that you'll need at the border when you arrive as well, including proof of vaccination, either digital or on paper. It's been strongly suggested by some experts that you print that out and have it so that you won't run into problems if you can't access it through your phone. So Heather, I think that answers the questions. Did I miss anything?
Cynthia, I have a feeling that you'll be busy, so
Okay.
we'll flip back to you when we need it.
Okay.
I think I'll do the first one since they were the first, and keep your camera on, Cynthia, because this will go back to you. I know that the vaccine plan and the travel plans are really confusing, and so I may ask a couple of questions that have similar responses in different ways, just so students will hopefully kind of understand. But do international students need to have a 14-day quarantine plan? So I believe that was the international plan that you were talking about, even if they're fully vaccinated and even though they are confident they won't test positive on arrival.
Yes, they do. Every international traveler entering Canada has to have a quarantine plan, whether they think they will be exempt or not. It's also important to download the ArriveCan app because that's where you'll enter all of your documentation required for travel, including your quarantine plan. And whether you have full vaccination and you have no symptoms and you're sure that you'll be able to come into the country without needing to quarantine, you still need to have a plan. It's required, and you can develop that plan in consultation with advisors from the International Centre. So thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Cynthia. And I will give you a bit of a break. And this next one is going to be for Carolyn. So we have a number of people, both before the event as well as in the chat, that's talking about bringing kind of relatives with them, whether that's children, family or friends, spouses. And so the question is, if they're coming and they are vaccinated, but maybe their child is not, do they still need to do the 14 days quarantine? And if yes, can they do that at home, or do they have to do that at the Westin?
Thanks, Heather. So right now, if they're coming into Nova Scotia, they would have to do their quarantine if they're under the age of 18 and they're traveling with their parents. They have to follow the least vaccinated parent. So if your parent only has one vaccine of the approved vaccines that's not being fully vaccinated, then that child or student has to follow with their parent or their family member with the least amount of vaccination. So the answer would be yes, they would be required to quarantine for the 14 days, 3 initially at the entry into Canada, and then 11 full days in Nova Scotia, and being able to leave quarantine on their 12th day. And that's following a day 8 test. So the day 8 test has to be back through Switch Health or whichever entry points you're coming in. There may be a different provider that you have to provide proof that you actually have a negative test at the end of day 8. And be able to leave quarantine on day 12 out of Nova Scotia. One of the other key points for students and family members coming in is not only do they have to upload their vaccination proof into the ArriveCan app if they are traveling internationally, but also into the Nova Scotia Safe Check-in application process. They will need that when they arrive into Nova Scotia, and they will need to provide that proof of what their quarantine plan has been approved for. And that would be under the designated learning institutions plan, which would, for us, would be at the Westin Hotel.
Perfect, thank you, Carolyn. And I forgot to introduce Carolyn before I push it over to her, but she is the Director of Student Success on the AC campus interim. But Carolyn is also a nurse and has been such a valuable resource here for us as we're working through all of this information related to COVID. And so, Cynthia, I hope you've had a chance to have a drink of water, but I have the next question for you. Is there any arrangement from the university to pick up international students from the airport?
Thanks, Heather. Yes, there is. All international students will be provided with transportation from the airport. And the way to arrange that is by contacting the International Center when you work on your quarantine plan or when you're making your travel plans. And I saw one of the questions in the chat about the quarantine plan where it's required. It is required at your port of entry, so wherever you land. And it's important to note too that as of August 9th, Halifax will be a destination where you can land. So if you haven't made your travel plans yet, you may want to bring that into consideration. And back to you, Heather.
Perfect. We have a question again about traveling, and so I think we've addressed family and friends traveling if they've been vaccinated, so I'll move on to the next one. And so, Cynthia, this is going to be for you again. But if you're traveling to Canada, you have your vaccines, you're good to go. Can you enter Canada directly from Toronto and come to Halifax same day?
Yes, you can. So once you are approved by Canadian Border Services Agency as being exempt from quarantine, you can travel directly to Halifax. And back to you, Heather.
Thank you. So again, I'm going to actually hand this one over to Kristen Sutherland. So Kristen is our Associate Registrar and Director of Student Recruitment and Undergraduate Admissions. And we do have a number of questions from students, both undergraduate and graduate programs, asking about deferring their admissions because of not being able to come to the country in time. And so what are those admission deadlines? What do those look like? And are they different for undergraduate and graduate students? So Kristen, over to you.
Thank you, Heather. For students that are concerned about the ability to arrive in Halifax and to begin their studies in September 2021, they can go to dal.ca and in the search bar look for deferral request. It will bring you to a page, and I'll share the link in the chat later this morning and through our resources after the event. But through that page for undergraduate students, you would be able to complete a request for deferral. And you can choose which term you're interested in being considered for. So some of our undergraduate programs do have January intakes, and you may be considering delay until next term. And some of our programs have a 1-year intake, so they only have one intake in September, so it will be a 1-year deferral. For graduate programs, I would really recommend that students reach out to their faculty advisors and the Faculty of Graduate Studies to discuss what is feasible based on their program of study and any sponsorship or scholarship that they may have associated with their graduate program. For the undergraduate program, if you do request a deferral of your admissions, I would also encourage you to consider requesting a deferral of your scholarship dollars to see if that is feasible as well. Thanks, Heather.
Perfect, thank you, Kristen. So next, I'm actually going to bring up Vivian Howard. So Vivian is our Associate Vice President Academic. And Vivian, we're getting a lot of questions of students who are concerned about things like their passport or visas not being approved in time, and whether there is the option of doing kind of online or a hybrid until they arrive in Canada. Vivian?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that unfortunately, there's no single answer to that question. In some cases, it will definitely be possible for students to begin their studies online and then transition to in-person, but it may not be possible in all cases. The answer to the question would depend on how long the student will be delayed, on the nature of the course that they're taking, whether or not there's required, hands-on components, and on the professor's mode of delivery. So I would say the key in this case, if a student feels that they may be delayed in their arrival, the key would be communication with an advisor, to let an advisor know that this is the situation, and the advisor can explore options with them to confirm whether or not it will be possible. I think in most cases, professors would be very willing to work with students and be as flexible as possible, but I'm just cautious that in some cases, if it's a very hands-on course, it may not be possible in all cases. So I would say the best thing to do would be register for your classes. And then if you think you may be place-bound and unable to come in September, we do have a specialized advising request form that you can fill in to explain more about your unique situation, and that will then allow us to link you with an advisor that can help you explore your options. Back to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Vivian. Lots of overlap with questions, which is so great to see. So hopefully we're kind of picking a couple off at the same time. I do want to address, someone was asking about insurance on campus, and for students that require insurance, it's provided by the Dalhousie Student Association. And we'll put that link in the announcement box. And so you'll be able to have that link if you have more questions about the DSU insurance plan as a student. So the other thing I wanted to talk about that I see in the chat a lot, and this one is going to go to Cynthia, and this is really around financial resources. And so students are asking if there are resources to help cover quarantine costs. And so it would be great if we could talk about both for international students as well as domestic students, as well as where students can go to find out more information about receiving some financial support from the institution. Cynthia?
Thanks, Heather. I'll start with for international students. So 50% of the cost of quarantine, if quarantine is required at the Weston, our approved quarantine location, is provided by the university for students who are new to Dalhousie or arriving in Halifax for the first time since COVID started. And that 50% amounts to around $850. The remaining 50% is the responsibility of the student. If you arrive in Canada before August 9th and you are required to do a 14-day quarantine, the first 3 days of that will be at a hotel at your airport entry site, and that full cost is up to you. I stress really strongly that you should contact the International Centre about setting up those bookings in the hotel, particularly the Weston, and they'll also book your airport transportation. And they'll also work with you on your quarantine plan that you must show when you enter Canada, and must also provide information for Nova Scotia Safe Check-in. So really good news that 50% has been extended to October 31st. I think until Friday, it said on our website August 31st, but now that support is extended. In addition to that, there is other financial support for students who are required to quarantine and require additional financial aid. The International Centre can point you in the right direction for that as well. For domestic students, there is some financial support available for those in need. And you can access information about that through the Money Matters website. And Heather, I believe that was listed on the list of resources and links. If it's not there, we'll make sure that it's sent out to everyone. So back to you, Heather.
Thanks, Cynthia. And it is definitely posted in our resources. So a heavily used site by students for sure. And we have team members posting different links in the chat as well so that you can have access to those. And so this question is going to go to Carolyn, as it again relates to questions around quarantining and what that looks like as a province. So Carolyn, if you're partially vaccinated with 1 dose, is the quarantine reduced to 7 days? And are students able to quarantine in residence? Carolyn.
Thanks, Heather. So if you're coming from an international location and you're partially vaccinated, so you're not fully vaccinated, then no, you do not have a 7-day option. If you're coming from an international location, then you are fully vaccinated, which means 2 doses, 14 days prior to the entry to Canada, and it has to be those 14 days, then you're considered fully vaccinated. You will be able to not have to quarantine at the port of entry. You will have to do a pre-entry COVID test, and you will have to do an arrival COVID entry test. And at those border officials will give the final okay as to whether or not you'll be considered fully vaccinated. If you're considered fully vaccinated, you pass your 2 tests, then you'll be able to go on to your new location. So if you're coming to Halifax, for example, you'll be able to go back to your apartment. And then they recommend testing when you arrive, but it's not required. If you are partially vaccinated and you're coming from a domestic location, then you do have a domestic location, meaning another province in Canada outside of the Atlantic provinces. You will be able to do a partial quarantine, which would be 7 full days in your quarantine plan site. And you will have to have some testing done when you first arrive in Nova Scotia and near the end of your 7-day quarantine in order to leave quarantine for that 7 days. If you're not vaccinated, then of course you get to come and you spend 14 days. As an international student, you would spend 3 days at your point of entry in Canada. You would have your pre-arrival testing, you would have your arrival testing, and then you would, after your COVID test comes back negative, where you enter Canada, then you'd be able to come to Nova Scotia, go to the Westin Hotel and spend 11 full days in quarantine, have a test on day 8, wait for the results of that test, and then be able to leave quarantine at the end of that 11-day quarantine, so on day 12. Heather, did I answer that totally?
I think that was fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.
Okay, so our next question is actually going to go to Jeff Wilson. And so Jeff is the Director of Residence Life. And so Jeff, people are wondering what happens if they need to change their move-in date to residence. And so maybe they need to move in earlier, they need to move in later. Who do they need to contact and what do they need to do about that? So over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Heather. I appreciate that people who have assigned rooms in residence likely still have some questions about when they can arrive. All of that is being done through our residence office. To be able to contact them, it's residence@dal.ca. Our scheduled arrival dates are September 1st to 4th. Students are allowed to pre-book a time that they will arrive during that time period, September 1st to 4th. So those who are planning their travel to complete their 14-day quarantine or their 7-day quarantine before being able to move into residence need to do so to be able to arrive September 1st to 4th. If that's not possible because of whatever your travel plans are or your vaccination plans, you're trying to get vaccinated before you get here with that 14 days, please contact the residence office. So residence@dal.ca, let them know your specific situation, let them know when you would like to arrive, whether or not you'll be required to isolate, and then they will arrange, or they'll try to arrange a very specific and unique arrival date for that individual student. I saw a question earlier about being able to leave, if you need to leave residence after the first semester, whether or not you can store things in residence. We provide storage to students leaving on co-op, leaving on an international term, only if they are intending to return to residence. So we don't provide storage to students who are never returning to residence. Yeah, and we are not providing isolation space in residence. So if you are an international student, you must stay at the Westin Hotel. If you are a domestic student arriving from outside of the Atlantic provinces, so a Canadian student arriving from outside of the Atlantic provinces, and you require isolation, you must do so on your own outside of residence. Thanks, Heather. I believe I addressed a couple other questions from the chat and the one that you gave me, so I'll send it back to you.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And so speaking of that, I'm going to bring back Cynthia to talk about a couple of things while we have you on screen. One is, I know that you're aware of some off-campus availability to quarantine, as well. A couple of questions around that is whether the most recent changes from the government means that students have to quarantine in a government hotel, and whether or not the travel ban from India is applicable for students who are fully vaccinated and have their study permit. So Cynthia, over to you with all those questions.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So the first one about off-campus quarantine. Dalhousie is an approved designated learning institution, and as such, we have a plan that was approved by both levels of government for how we will support international students who arrive in Canada and are required to quarantine. And part of that plan is that we provide airport transportation, we provide ongoing support, and students are required to quarantine at an approved location selected by Dalhousie. Currently, that's the Westin Hotel. So currently, if you are required to quarantine, you must quarantine at the Westin. And you may be eligible for the financial supports that I mentioned in answering a previous question, but it is still a requirement, and that has not changed. The other piece about the travel ban from India, the travel ban is on flights from India, not on individuals. And I think that's a really important differentiation to make. So if you're able to travel from India to Canada through other ways other than flights that come directly from India, then you would be able to enter the country as an international student with a valid study permit or letter of introduction, like any other international student. And your exemption from quarantine would be determined exactly the same way as any other international student. I will say that there will be some complications in that travel based on testing requirements before you arrive in Canada and before you board flights. And my recommendation is that you talk to the International Centre. I will say this over and over again, but when thinking about those travel plans and booking your flights and developing your quarantine plan, be sure to consult with the International Centre. I will also go back to some of those changes that are effective on August 9th, which may have a bearing on when you select to travel to Canada. Because as of August 9th, if you're exempt from quarantine and you're required to quarantine, you will not be required to spend that 3 days at an airport hotel. And the testing requirements after entry, not before entry, but after entry, have also changed. So, consult with the International Centre. Be aware that all of these requirements are subject to change at any time and have been ever changing. That, I think, explains a lot of the complexity that you're probably wondering about as we're answering all of your questions. But please consult with the International Centre, and please ensure that if you're checking government websites that you are looking at the most up-to-date information. So thanks, Heather, and back to you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Thank goodness we have you here. And obviously we have a lot of international students here with us, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do it at this time, so it's so great to see. But we know that a lot of your situations are really specific, and so please reach out to the International Centre and they can support you with those questions. And we'll be putting the email address as well as the website in the chat. So I'm going to switch it up, and this question is going to be for Vivian. And Vivian, someone is asking about when is the last day to change courses in case they want to move from online courses to in-person or vice versa. Vivian?
Thanks. Sorry, thanks, Heather. And that would be the last day for any student to be able to add or drop a course. So that date is September 17th. And that would be the date at, where, the final date for students to be switching from class to class and making changes in their course plan for the fall. So that would be the date. Back to you, Heather.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Vivian. Lots of advising questions, lots of differences based on program, based on faculty. And so we shared the request for advising form earlier, and so please feel free to fill that out. There's also, you can go to dal.ca/where to go for advising, and we'll include the link as well. It's a great resource to figure out all of the plethora of advisors that are available for you on campus. So the next kind of questions that we have are going to go to Carolyn, and these really involve domestic travel. So we have some domestic students who are not able to get quarantined, or sorry, not able to get vaccinated before the start of classes, and so wondering where they can quarantine for 14 days and whether there's any assistance from Dalhousie or the Nova Scotia provincial government. So Carolyn, I'll hand that over to you.
Thanks, Heather. So domestic travel is similar in international travel in that you still, outside of the Atlantic provinces, have to apply to enter Nova Scotia and upload your vaccination proof. If you haven't been vaccinated, or if you've only had one dose of vaccine, and again, it has to be the approved vaccines, then you can actually get your vaccine when you enter Nova Scotia. So after you've completed your whichever quarantine that you're required, so if you have no vaccinations, then you're 14 days off campus from outside the Atlantic provinces, you have the option of quarantining at the Westin Hotel, which provides, which is our designated learning institution quarantine site. So a domestic traveler can also use that option, or they can book an off-campus site. But they have to make sure that they meet the Nova Scotia self-isolation requirements, which are listed in the COVID-NS site, which we'll post in the chat. So they're specific to if you're isolating by yourself or if you're isolating with others. So there are certain requirements around how to isolate with others, and they're very specific under the COVID Nova Scotia site. If you need vaccines when you arrive in Nova Scotia, if you don't have a Nova Scotia health card, then you're able to call a 1833 number and actually book your vaccines while you're here after you've finished your isolation at no cost to you. If you have a health card from another province, you can provide that health card, or if you have insurance, you can provide those insurance numbers, but there isn't a charge specific to a student to get their vaccines while they're here. They just need to follow the processes for actually booking them in Nova Scotia. And I think that answered the question. Back to you, Heather.
Thanks, Carolyn, and you're not going to be off the hot seat yet. I have two more for you. One is around, what about if a student is coming from another Atlantic province, say New Brunswick, and they are not vaccinated? Do they have to quarantine for 14 days? And then also, while I have you, what about traveling during the semesters? Are students going to be able to travel either domestically or internationally during the term? For you, Carolyn.
So Heather, that's a great question. So traveling from PEI, Newfoundland, or New Brunswick, whether you're vaccinated or you're not vaccinated, you can enter Nova Scotia and you do not have to quarantine. Of course, we're strongly recommending that people follow the recommendations from the Public Health of Nova Scotia, who are encouraging everyone to get vaccinated, excuse me, prior to arrival. With regard to traveling during the semester, you'll still have to follow whatever the Nova Scotia government is actually putting in place. And right now, looking into the fall, you'll still have to apply to come back into the province. and you'll still have to meet those criteria that are presently listed on the Nova Scotia site. So if you leave Nova Scotia, go to Ontario, spend some time there, then you'll have to apply to come back. And if you're not fully vaccinated, then yes, you will have to quarantine based on your vaccination status. Those requirements may change as time goes on. So students should keep an eye on the Nova Scotia COVID site to see what the current recommendations are and requirements are to enter back into Nova Scotia. The hope is that everyone who is traveling is getting their vaccinations completed so that it makes travel so much easier and so much more safer for themselves and for their communities. And the other part is if you're an international traveler or a domestic traveler traveling from Nova Scotia to Ontario and back, say for example, you had a vaccination that was not approved by Health Canada, coming back into Nova Scotia, you will be required to isolate again for the 14 days for that same reason. One of the other points that I just wanted to make, Heather, that was a question listed in the chat was around, what if I've already had COVID and I've recovered from COVID? Does that mean I don't have to isolate or quarantine? And no, that does not. Just because you've had COVID doesn't mean that you still don't have to follow the vaccination status in order to enter, because you can get COVID again. What you may have differences in when you're coming into Nova Scotia or coming into Canada is that your testing requirements may change. You are often remaining positive by testing for potentially up to 180 days, but that does not change your vaccination status, and which will not change your quarantine requirements or your self-isolation requirements based on that vaccination status. Back to you, Heather.
Thanks, Carolyn, and I hope everyone noticed our friend Dal Tiger and Carolyn's background, helping her out there. So we're going to switch it up a little bit, and I actually have a question for Jerry. And so someone is wondering about research labs and when they'll be opening to full capacity, as this has lots of students need access to the research labs to complete their degree requirements. Over to you, Jerry.
Thanks, Heather, for the question. And look, we need to apologize to all the graduate students who we know that are struggling to get their time in those research labs. We're looking to try to create as much space as we can as we're in the stage 4 within the province now, and we expect a much greater opening as we enter stage 5. So of course, again, that's driven by the vaccination rates, but as soon as we can get to stage 5, those spaces can be opened fully again. And we're looking to do it right now, whatever we can to increase the spaces, the density in some of those spaces immediately. So we understand that problem and are working diligently to try to find a solution for it. Thanks, Heather.
Thanks, Jerry. And the next question is going to go over to Jeff in residence. And this is a question that we would typically get any other year. So it's nice to see some normality, but this question is about whether or not there's Wi-Fi in residence and is it unlimited?
Thanks, Heather. It's nice to answer a question that isn't directly COVID related. We have dedicated Wi-Fi for all of our residence buildings in Halifax and in Truro. We actually set up our own networks outside of the regular Dell network so that we have more dedicated bandwidth to our residence buildings. All of our residence rooms individually have the ability to plug in an Ethernet cord to increase the speed that much more. It all takes your Dalhousie Net ID and password to be able to sign in. So anywhere in residence, you can use the Wi-Fi. It's unrestricted. It has very fast upload and download speeds. So if you're a gamer or a YouTube influencer, you have the ability to do all of that in residence without interruption. And then there's a seamless transition once you leave the residence building to the rest of our Dalhousie networks when you go back to your academic buildings, when you go to the library, when you go to the student union building, when you go to the gym. So it's all the same username and password. 2 different networks, one dedicated for residents, one dedicated for the rest of campus. It's all high speed and it's all unrestricted. Thanks, Heather. I'll send it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. And there are a couple of comments I see about, trying to contact different people. So I'm going to tell you this. If you can email me at heather.doyle@dal.ca directly, and I will make sure that your questions get to the appropriate people if you haven't had luck with that so far. For the next question, I'm going to pass it back over to Cynthia. We haven't heard from you in a while. A couple of students are asking about the government hotel approved hotel in Halifax, which is of course the Westin, and how they go about booking. Is there help for that? And so just maybe a little bit of a reminder about the Westin. And so Cynthia.
Great. Thanks, Heather. So to book the Westin, you contact the International Centre and they will make the booking for you and arrange for your airport transportation as well. So that link, dal.ca/international is the website for the International Centre, which has all of the information about your quarantine plan, your hotel booking, and your travel bookings. It's strongly encouraged that you contact the center before you book travel to ensure that the dates are going to align with all of the changing requirements and regulations. So thanks, Heather, and back to you.
Thanks, Cynthia. So time flies, and so we've got about 9 minutes left. And so one of the questions that we have is around when can students drop all of their classes, receive kind of their money back, that kind of thing, if they're not able to arrive in Canada. And so I think, Kristen, I will hand this over to you. And again, the question is around deferral dates. And I know you're not going to have the information for all programs. And so where can they find that information?
Hi, thank you so much. Again, I can post the deferral form. I've posted it in the chat. And for those of you that are pursuing undergraduate studies, you can complete that deferral form to request a deferral to winter 2022 or September 2022 if you're not able to join this semester. You can make that request up until September 2021 for undergraduate studies, and then it comes through our team for assessment. For graduate level deferrals, I would refer you back to your faculty advisor or to the Faculty of Graduate Studies, as they will have the regulations and information on each particular graduate program. Thanks, Heather. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect, thank you. And I can see as I'm going through some of the chats that a lot of the panelists are answering some of the chats as well. And so we did have a couple of questions that were submitted prior to the event that I just wanted to have an opportunity to take a look at and to address. And so Cynthia, actually I'm going to send this one to Carolyn. Sorry, I mixed it up down there, but this is going to go for you, Carolyn, because I noticed that a couple of people were asking about Pfizer and the amount of time that's allowed between the vaccines, and that's a great question, one I don't know either. So can you address that to the best of your knowledge?
Sure, thanks, Heather. So normally the dosing interval is 21 days between the first dose and the second dose as recommended by Pfizer. That's the minimum dosing interval. So in Nova Scotia, initially, based on availability of vaccine for Pfizer and other vaccines, and on the Nova Scotia requirements and being able to deliver vaccines, initially we had an interval of 105 days, and then they were gradually able to decrease that back to presently 28 days, the dosing interval. So if you're in Nova Scotia, your dosing interval is actually at 28 days presently, and that may change based on availability of vaccinations and based on availability of drug. So sometimes that's confusing to students to see where Nova Scotia is providing a 28-day interval, where the monograph for the drug itself says a minimum of 21 days. I will defer to Glenn if he has anything else that he'd like to add on that. But that would be the difference that I think students are noticing, the difference of what happens in Nova Scotia as compared to what the actual drug manufacturer says.
Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah, I don't really have anything to add other than as well, because of availability of Pfizer vaccine, we are encouraging people to consider, if it's not available, to get the Moderna vaccine. So the 2 mRNA vaccines are considered interchangeable, as recommended by NACI, the National Advising Council on Immunization. And we've been running Moderna vaccine clinics here in the Student Health and Wellness Center for the last 6 weeks, and we'll continue to do so as the vaccine is available.
Great, thank you so much, Glenn. Dr. Glenn Andrea is one of our fabulous doctors in health and wellness, and so when you come to campus, you might be lucky to see Glenn as a doctor. So we only have 4 minutes left, and so I just want to go to one more question, and this is going to be for Jerry, and it's going to be a bit of a twofold. And so this was a question that came in beforehand, and it was around course sizes and bigger classes. And so someone was asking, will there be options for students who maybe don't feel comfortable being in a classroom of 400 plus people? And then I also want to make sure I name some of the comments that I'm seeing in the chat about graduate students. And do you have suggestions on, in particular, current grad students who they can contact to receive more information about what's happening in the fall? So I'll hand it over to you, Jerry.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So firstly, we don't expect public health to have restrictions on class size. So we do expect to see classrooms in that 400 plus range, and we believe we can do that very safely. We understand that people may have some anxiety with the thought of being around 400 people. That's completely normal. We spent the better part of the last 2 years telling people to be afraid of each other. So that's normal and expected. And, you know, so we will do things like making sure that the air quality is good in spaces, and people can wear masks if they need to. If you're looking for ways to do that course virtually, so to speak, that's not really within my purview. No, I'd have to push it back, Heather, if someone else could respond to that that aspect of it. I know some faculties have some thing, but it's not really something that I can speak directly about. And Heather, I've forgotten the second part of that question. What was that?
It was around graduate students.
Oh, graduate students. So I know there's a meeting that will talk about graduate spaces. It is right after we're done this. So I can tell you that that subject is active, and we're looking at how we can increase the density in those spaces for graduates to do their research right now. So that meeting will happen as soon as we hang up from this one. And I know that there will be what we can do to increase the density even in stage 4 and look for a wide reopening in stage 5. Back to you, Heather.
Great, thank you, Jerry. I'm glad I asked. And so maybe I'll throw the second part over to you in terms of what if a student doesn't feel comfortable in a larger size class at different times during the year? What are some of their options about connecting with their faculty? Vivian?
Thanks, Heather. Just very quickly, I know our time is almost up, but just to remind students that generally courses that are delivered in person won't also be available online. They won't have a parallel online streaming option unless that's indicated on the timetable. And again, if students are feeling that they simply cannot attend that class in person, because it's a large lecture class and they're feeling unsafe or they have an underlying condition, they can use that specialized advising form to work with an advisor to explore their options. So just very, very quickly. Back to you, Heather.
Perfect, thanks, Vivian. And we've got a minute left. And so we really wanted to thank you for taking time out of your morning, afternoon, evening to take part in this discussion. I know that there are a lot of questions and there's a lot of confusion. It depends on where you're from. It depends on what year you're in. There's so many different things to take into consideration. And so really encourage you to reach out to that student.affairs@dal.ca email to ensure that your questions are answered specifically. If you have other issues that you want to make sure, again, I'll throw my email out there, heather.doyle@dal.ca. We are here to support you and to make sure that your questions get answered. And so we're looking forward to seeing you back on campus this fall, and we'll be keeping you updated throughout the summer. You can continue to visit dal.ca/fall 2021, and you can see that on the university resources. And we will ensure that all the latest information continues to go up there, including public health guidelines for masks and distancing to testing to vaccination. Doing so will help bring our Dal community safely back together again. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day, evening, night, afternoon, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.